And good afternoon. My name is Thomas Caldwell and I'm the programmer at the Melbourne International Film Festival. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. Welcome to Bruce Beresford in Conversation, a MIFF Talks event presented in partnership with the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. This year the MIFF Talks program is presented by the University of Melbourne, Faculty of Fine Arts and Music. Today's guest, of course, is Bruce Beresford, who has directed over 30 feature films, including 1992's Black Robe, which has just been restored by the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia, and MIFF were honoured to have held the world premiere screening of that restoration yesterday. And today Bruce will be speaking with Philippa Hawker. Philippa is the former editor of Cinema Papers. She wrote about film and the arts for The Age and is now a film writer for The Australian. Philippa, thank you. Over to you.
Thomas. Well, Bruce, I am going to reintroduce you a little bit because I think even though people know your work so well, sometimes they forget just how many films and how many different kinds of films you've made. So I'm not going to list them all, but just to remind us all how, I think you've gone from drama to comedy to thriller to character pieces, period films, biopics, and even the odd biblical epic.
Oh,
well, I won't. You've adapted novels, plays, a comic strip, memorably, and also you direct operas, and you've written several books, and you've given us an incredibly wide range of Australian subjects, from Barry Mackenzie to Mao's Last Dancer, from Breaker Morant to The Fringe Dwellers, from Puberty Blues to Ladies in Black. And you go very many places, but you come home as well to make films, and that's a wonderful thing. I think probably, I don't know whether people remember, but you've actually had 4 films nominated for the Cannes Palme d'Or. And you've been nominated twice for Academy Awards, and other people have done quite well out of you at the Academy as well. I think as particularly Jessica Tandy in Driving Miss Daisy and Robert Duvall for Tender Mercies. But I don't want to dwell, and we will obviously talk about the past, but there are things to talk about in the future as well. But one thing I do want to start with, I just discovered this wonderful story you told me before about a Q&A in which you were in the audience and Alfred Hitchcock was on the stage. Can you and you asked a question to which he took exception.
I'll tell the story again.
Please do.
Is the mic working?
Yeah.
It is.
Please
okay.
do.
Well, it was in London. It must have been in the early 60s, and I'd only been in England a short while, and they used to have in a theatre in Wardour Street, they'd have a screening of a film, then they'd have the director there. I remember they had John Frankenheimer once and Ruben Mamoulian, but this time it was Alfred Hitchcock, and they showed the film Marnie, and at the end of it, they asked, Hitchcock came on and they said, are there any questions? Well, everybody sort of sat there, and then I rather foolishly stood up and I said, in the film, Mr. Hitchcock, there's a scene of a boat at a wharf, which is obviously sort of painted and it doesn't look real at all. I mean, I said, what was the reason for doing it, something that looks so fake? And then he looked at me and he said, who are you, sir? And I said, oh, my name's Bruce Beresford. Australian, I haven't been in London for very long. And then he said, you're one of those people they call a film buff. And he had a very acid way of talking. You must have seen him on TV. And then he said, let me assure you that an audience watching this film would accept that boat and that dock as being completely realistic. It would never look fake to them. It only looks fake to film buffs like you. Now, the funny thing was I knew that everyone in that audience would have agreed with me, but nobody said a word. And that was the end of the conversation. I sat down.
Well, future Bruce Beresford's in the audience, be assured we'll have a chance to answer questions, ask questions like that at the end. But we'll have about 15 minutes for questions, and we'll just, see how impertinent they are. Because One of the things about your career is that you fell in love with movies very young, didn't you? And you knew almost immediately that this was what you wanted to do.
Yes, that's true. I mean, I was, from when my parents never liked me going to films. It was always a battle to get out to a film. And there was finally an agreement that I could go to a Saturday afternoon matinee. That was it. And we lived in Springwood. That was where I started to see them, in the Blue Mountains outside Sydney. And I must have been very young because we left there when I was about 7. So I'd already seen films there. And I already knew that the name on the credits that fascinated me was the director, because I think something told me that this was the person who really was responsible for the film. And then I realised pretty quickly, certainly over a couple of years, that a director of a film was like a painter of a picture, that they all had an individual style. And I got so that there were styles I liked and there were directors I liked, and there was other people whose films I wouldn't even go to.
And who were some of the directors who caught your
attention? Well, in those days, initially they were nearly all American. There was people like John Ford, Howard Hawks, John Sturges, Anthony Mann, Bud Boudica. And certainly from the English end of it, I loved the films of Carol Reed. And there were others, David Lean, there were a few others as well. But I quickly learnt about directors, even quite minor directors from America. And I remember, even going to the Saturday matinees, my friends would be saying, we're going to see this Butte Western at the Civic in Parramatta. And I'd say, I remember saying this, I said, I'm not going. And they said, oh, you love going. I said, it's directed by Leslie Selander and he's a complete hack. And I wouldn't go. And Leslie Selander is a complete hack.
But you also actually did have, you started making films very young as well, didn't you? You got a camera.
I did. I made 8mm films with school friends. And then I moved to 16mm when I was maybe 15 or so. And I made some short films, and a couple of those got into festivals around the world. And then I thought, well, of course, I'd always wanted to make a career of it. So once a couple of the 16mm films were shown, I thought, well, this is for me.
But there wasn't a film school you could go to then,
no,
was there?
There were no film schools in Australia then. And it was very disappointing to me. I sent a couple of my films to the film school at University of Southern California. And they wrote back a very nice letter and said, we like the films, Bruce, and we'd like to offer you a scholarship. But under American law, you have to arrive in America with $500. That was at that time.
Right.
And I thought $500 was an awful lot of money. And my parents didn't have any money, but I had a very wealthy old aunt. And I went and saw her, and she said, no, dear, it's a complete waste of time. So it never happened. I never got to the University of Southern California Film School. I was very, very disappointed for a while. But then I just kept making short films anyway.
So in a sense, you really, you learned to do all of those things that you needed to do in your own way.
Yes, I did.
Which is probably, in some ways, a very valuable way of...
I think it was. I remember buying a very cheap book called How to Direct. And it was actually pretty good because it had little drawings of how not to cross the line. You know what crossing the line is? So that you don't have people talking to each other appear to be looking at each other. If you put the camera in the wrong place, they'll both appear to be looking in the same direction. So there were things like that I learned out of this book, How to Direct, which I kept with me for a very long time. Even when I first went to America, I was reading up how to direct.
One of the things that's been very characteristic of your filmmaking the whole time is you storyboard very carefully, don't you? And in a sense, you're very well prepared for when you go into production. You know exactly what it is you want.
Yes, I do storyboard everything. Once the script is done and I've got a good sense of where the locations are and what they look like, I storyboard everything. Because I remember one of the actors said to me once on a film, why don't you just improvise and, be like other directors, and you say, oh, what if we do this? What if we do that? And I said, well, that's what I am doing, but I'm doing it on the storyboard first. I said, it's the same thing, but I like to think it out. Also, if I storyboarded, it enables me to see the scenes in relation to one another. Because what you've got to think of when you're directing, I think the key thing is what the scene will be like when it's in the film, not by itself. Because you've got to think of it, it could be 90 minutes or 2 hours, and you have to say, will it work in context, not by itself? Because I've had director friends, I remember in London, a wonderful Australian director called Don Levy. Did you know him?
No.
He made a feature called Herostratus that it was remarkable, technically remarkable. And he was editing it at the British Film Institute where I was working, and he used to show me scenes from it. It looked absolutely amazing. But when you put it all together, it didn't make any sense at all because the scenes didn't flow, it didn't relate. But if I storyboard, it helps me do that.
So you've got the whole in mind, and so you can, and sometimes you just find you have to sacrifice a scene that could be really wonderful in isolation, but doesn't belong.
Well, it's not that you'd remove a scene, it's just that if I storyboard it, I can work out
where
the balance of shots. For example, if you have a scene where it's called for everything to be in close shots, probably the next scene I'd do differently to balance it visually. And I usually work all that out in a fair bit of detail.
You can recognise directors' works quite readily from seeing a little bit of their work on a film on television. You can say, I know who made that. I gather that comes from, I think, obviously from watching films.
Yes,
yourself.
Well, directors, they do have very distinctive styles. Very.
Yes.
A lot of them are very, very obvious. You can always pick, say, a Fellini film. Anybody could do it. Anybody could pick an Antonioni film, probably a Scorsese film. But there's a lot of other directors that, you'd think, oh, well, they're all the same, but they're not really. They do have styles.
And do you have a distinctive style?
Well, it's interesting. I've never been aware of it.
No, I guess. Do you think anybody else would be?
Film editors have told me that I've worked with. They said, oh, when your stuff comes in, we always know how it's going to go together because it's shot in a certain way. But it's a way that I don't really think about it.
And probably if you were too aware of it, it would.
Yes,
that would be problematic.
People sometimes say, "Oh, are you doing this film? Is it an homage to some other director, or are you influenced by some other director?" I don't. As much as I admire so many directors, I don't think I work like that. I think I just try and. I'm obsessed usually with the story, and I just try to tell it as simply as I can.
When it comes to scripts, are you good at recognising immediately that that you want to do a film, or that that this is a good script but it needs work, or how do you go with picking what you want to do?
Well, it's just a matter of reacting emotionally to a script. It's a bit like reading a novel. And saying, well, this is a load of crap, and you throw it away after a couple of chapters, or getting completely gripped by it. So you always find you're reading it on the train, you're reading it on the bus, you're reading it in bed, reading it in the bath. I do that. And you can't put it down because the story engages you so strongly. Well, I am like that with scripts.
Because, of course, reading's very important to you anyway, isn't it? It's a very important part of books are very important to you. And a lot of the works you've adapted have been from books that you love.
Yes, that's true. I have read a number of books that I wanted, and plays that I wanted to, sometimes, like in New York one year, I went to this play I'd never heard of, the one about the three sisters.
Oh, Crimes of the Heart.
Crimes of the Heart, and I saw it, and I thought, this is an absolutely great play. And then I went to Hollywood, and I said to my agent, I've got to make a film of that. It's fantastic. And he said, oh, well, go and talk to Dino De Laurentiis. So I went and saw Dino, and he didn't speak English, not much. And he said, oh, what is it? It's a play. And I said, look, we'll get you an Italian translation. So we gave it to him, and then he said, we make this film.
And no
but
one
it
else.
doesn't, look, people doesn't usually happen like that.
that easily. I was
There's
going to
usually
say,
like 100 people getting in the way.
That has
but when
to
you
be.
when you had someone like De Laurentiis or Richard Zanuck, they could make the decisions. Unfortunately, they've both dropped off the perch.
I guess that is part of, how hard, part of the process of making a film. The hard part is actually getting it all happening, isn't it? It's and that sounds like the easiest example ever, but
yes,
a rare one.
Yes, it's rare.
Yeah.
It's hard to get them off the ground. There's a lot of money involved, millions of dollars, even for very cheap films, and investors, distributors, production companies become understandably very anxious. And they think, well, it won't work, we can't do this, we can't do that, it's unlikely to appeal unless we get Mel Gibson in it, all this sort of thing. So they often talk about it, then back away. It's very, very tricky.
Your first film, I mean, you had wanted to make, in fact, The Getting of Wisdom. Was that meant to be your first film? Was that the idea? Or
yes, it was. The Getting of Wisdom was the first one I tried to get going. And then, no, actually, that's not quite right. It was the second one because I was in London and I said to Barry Humphries, who I knew, I said, there's money coming available in Australia. We should do a script of the Barry Mackenzie films from your comic strip.
So you actually did that, because that is your first feature.
It was, and then Barry was away doing shows or something, and I said, well, look, I'll write a script adapting from the comic strip while you're away. Then when you come back, look at it, we'll go through it together. And that's what we did. And then we sent it, I think, to Philip Adams. And Philip said, oh, this is very funny, we'll get it. And we set it up through the Film Commission without a lot of problems. I mean, Philip Adams was, I don't know, I think he'd founded the Film Commission, or he had some big job on it. And so we got the money, which was very modest. It was made for about $250,000.
And it was a big hit.
Yeah, well, it nearly ruined my career.
I was about to say, that's an example where a commercial hit, you'd think that would make things big.
It was a commercial hit and a critical disaster, fiasco, and put me out of work for years. I had to go back to England, and I was working over there.
Because you got lots of
I was the kind of yobbo of the month. I mean, people took it serious. I don't know, Barry and I just thought it was good fun, it was a joke, and we'd say, oh, here's a funny joke, and the comic strip was a scream, and we both thought, well, this is really enjoyable, people will like it. Well, people did, but critically, it was an absolute, total disaster.
And I think it gave a bit of the wrong impression of you as a filmmaker too, in a way, didn't it? People thought, oh, he just wants to make more of these kinds of films.
I just got written off as a kind of lout, which I suppose I was.
So it did take a little while for you.
In a way, I got rescued. I mistakenly made a second Barry Mackenzie film because Reg Grundy's company told me that if I made the second Mackenzie, they would finance The Getting of Wisdom.
Right.
So I made the second Mackenzie, which was also successful, and then Grundy backed out of the agreement. He wouldn't do it. And then I didn't know what to do, because by now, now I'd made two films that were critically slaughtered. And I was back in London again, and then Philip Adams called me and said, do you know a play called Don's Party? And I said, no, and because it had been on in Australia while I was in England. And he said, I'll send it to you. So he sent it, and I read it. I said, this is absolutely wonderful. It's marvellously written. Characters are terrific. And I'd love to direct it. I didn't know at the time he'd offered it to nearly every director in Australia. They'd all turned it down. Basically because it has 11 people in one room for the entire film. And I said, no, I can do that.
Well, this is where storyboarding really does come into its own.
Well, then Don's Party was really pretty successful, and it went to festivals
critically
around the
successful
world.
as well,
And
wasn't
that
it?
worked. So then, after that, I did, at last, the Getting of Wisdom.
Because I mean, you've had a few passion projects over the years, and that you've managed. Some of them you've managed to get made.
Oh,
And
yeah, not
some
all.
of them you haven't. Yeah,
No.
but it's kind of wonderful that one got made. And Don's Party has a real. It felt very relevant in the last election. In fact, I'm afraid.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it for years and years.
Because it's interesting, isn't it, that you were saying that when we had a look at that wonderful restoration of Black Robe the other day, that it's you don't go back and see your films, and that does make sense, doesn't it? Really.
Well, yes. I mean, what's the point?
That you've done
occasionally.
them. You've done them, yes.
Yeah,
I think
you've done
you
them.
said that, yes,
Yeah.
that novelists don't go back and
I
read
know
their novels.
when I was working in China on Mao's Last Dancer, I switched the TV on one day and there was this film came on, and my son was in the other room, and I said, "Come and have a look at this film. It's really, really well done." And we sat down and he said, "Well, you know what that is?" I said, "No, I've never seen it." He said, "It's Tender Mercies. You directed it yourself."
So you didn't recognise your own distinctive style in that
It was
case.
scene after scene I had no recollection of.
Such a terrific film too. Oh.
It was good, but there were scenes. Finally, the scene came on that I did remember. Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about working with actors? Because I talked to Brian Brown recently, and he said that he made a couple of films with you, Breaker Morant and Money Movers, I think.
Yeah.
His two. And he said that he found that it was wonderful the way you could work differently with different actors. He said he really needed someone to be flippant with him on set, whereas other people needed someone to be serious with them. And is that something you're aware of, that you kind of need to sort of handle different actors differently, just when you're on set, just to see what they...
Not really, though I suppose that happens anyway, because, you know, they're all different personalities, and you think, well, some of them... Well, I suppose the thing in common is that I never walk up to any actors and say, "Well, that was absolutely bloody awful, and what you've got to do is this." I'd always walk up and say, "That's fantastic, it's really good. I've had a thought. Maybe if you do so-and-so." So I never undermine them. And usually it's because I'm quite sincere about the way they're I wouldn't have cast them unless I thought they were good. So I'm always trying to be encouraging.
But I mean, you did have a little bit of trouble with Robert Duvall in Tender Mercies, didn't you?
The trouble with Duvall was never with acting.
No.
He was fine to direct as an actor because I'd storyboard it all, and he'd just say, I'll come here, I'll walk over there, yeah. And he was fine. Apart from that, he was as mad as a cut snake. I mean, he was hostile to the crew, very, quite uncooperative in many ways. I mean, especially considering he was the producer. I remember one scene.
Let's see.
Well, that actually gave him a bit of extra clout,
Yes,
you see, which was difficult. I remember one scene we had to go right across Houston to film a scene of him coming out of a bar. And I'd planned it so that as he comes out of the bar, it's sunset. And I said to Bob, well, look, he had this caravan, it was about 100 feet long. And I said, we can't get across Houston to film the sunset if you take the caravan, because it's too big to get through the traffic and get us there in time. And he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, you get in the car with me and we'll drive over and we get there and we'll get the shot. And he said, oh, I can't do that. I can't do it without the caravan. And I said, Bob, it's just one shot. And it's for you. I'm doing this to make the film better for you, that you're the producer of. And he wouldn't do it. Oh. And so we went, he took the caravan and we got the shot. He's coming out of the bar in the dark. I mean, it wasn't as good.
No.
But it was typical of his rather bizarre attitude. Oh. But actually, on the credit, he's a fantastic actor. I mean, watching him, I used to be completely absorbed. I'd often forget to call cut because he was so good. And he'd look at me and I'd say, oh, cut. And because he was so brilliant and so immersed in the role and so thoughtful. I mean, you could, when you filmed him, he'd be listening to someone else talking, and he was just as good as when he was speaking, because it was like he was actually there and it was all happening. You never got the feeling he was acting at all.
And it's a wonderful thing to have in your film, even if it comes with a few problems along the way. I know we were talking before about budgets just before we came on, and I know Break and Morant was a film you made for a very small budget. Would it have been very different if you'd been able to spend more money on it, do you think?
Yes, well, probably would have.
What would you? I mean, would it? What difference do those kinds of things make? Because I think you've had to work with some pretty stringent budgets at times, haven't you? And I just wonder.
Frequently.
Yes. Yeah. What in the end?
Well, in Break and Morant, it had a few action scenes. I could have done them better. I mean, we had so few extras that in the scene where the Boers attacked the fort, the same actors played the British soldiers defending the fort. I mean, I filmed the Boers one day coming in on their horses. Then the next day, I dressed them as British soldiers and had them in the tents fighting. I mean,
that's definitely...
I'd rather not have had to do that.
That is definitely a constraint. And then the biggest budget you had was Double Jeopardy, I think you said.
Double Jeopardy, or maybe King David was bigger.
Yeah. Oh, do you know? But I read a very favourable review of King
What?
David. Yes. Look it up. It's Sheila Benson in the LA Times, and she spoke very favourably of the action sequences. So,
King David.
Yes.
Her mind must have been wandering.
Well, perhaps we'll put King David to one side.
Yeah,
and
Double
talk.
Jeopardy may have been bigger budget.
Because I mean that's a film.
Well, it was a big studio film.
Yes, So that was a film that because you worked on that. You with I think behind this you had some script work with Robert Benton. Is that right? Did he work?
Oh yes, Rob. Well, the original writers. Oh gosh, I can't remember the names now. Two very, very nice guys who'd been working together since they were at Harvard together. And then they worked, they were real Hollywood writers. They worked in the morning from 8 o'clock till 12 o'clock on, say, the Double Jeopardy script. They'd break for lunch, they'd have another film between 1 and 5, and then in the evening a third film. So I could work with them only in the mornings because they're on another film after that. But once the script was done, I wasn't that happy with it, and the studio, I kept saying, look, it's got these faults, we need to get someone in. And Sherry Lansing suggested Robert Benton, who was a marvellous writer and director. And Bob came in and worked on, and he made it a lot more fluent, he made it funnier, he had a better touch with the dialogue, he got rid of clunky scenes, he did a lot of really fabulous work.
And then at that stage, you hadn't cast it?
You what?
Had you cast it at that stage? Was that?
Yes, I think we'd still cast it with Jodie Foster, who was going to be the original lead. And then she pulled out, she got pregnant, pulled out, and then we had for a while Michelle Pfeiffer, who was a nightmare and wanted to change the script. And get rid of all the other women, any other women in it, she wanted them out, which wasn't going to work. And then we dropped her, and then Ashley Judd came along. Yeah, I don't think Ashley ever read the script.
So she definitely didn't want to change it under those circumstances. Yeah, because I mean that was quite a hit, wasn't it? And
it was a big hit,
and
it's on television now all the time. It was on TV in Sydney last week.
And you got sent, presumably, scores and scores of similar scripts?
Yes, I got a lot of scripts sent that were remarkably in the same genre, sort of action, light-hearted action things. I never did anymore. Well, I always felt I'd done it. But that happens a lot, you know. After I did Tender Mercies, I got offered a lot of sort of Deep South films, with, characters wandering around with bits of straw between their, and going to being very religious or being in the Ku Klux Klan. I got offered a lot of those.
But you don't want to repeat yourself?
No.
No. You do read reviews, don't you?
Not many.
Not many. I mean, what's your feeling as a director? Do you read the reviews of other people? Do you read reviews of other people's films as well?
Yes, other people's films. I don't mind reading them.
Yes.
No, I don't. Do I read the reviews? No, I try and avoid them.
Of your own films?
Yes, I try and avoid them.
Yeah. You keep a diary, don't you?
Yes.
Yes. What function does that
Well, the
perform for
main
you?
reason I keep the diary is that some years ago, my accountant in California, he'd call and he'd say, how many days were you in California in the last 4 months? Because it's for tax, you see.
Right.
And I'd say, oh, God, I don't know. And I go through hell. And so about 7 or 8 years ago, I just started keeping a diary of where I was. And then when they call now and say, how long were you in California? Say, it happened recently. They said, how many days were you in California this year? Well, I could look it up, and I was in California.
So
for
it's
8
just
days.
a sort of. It's
But
not
then so what I did is the diary's just got a little kind of memorandum of where I was and who I spoke to.
So it's something like the memoir you wrote. Josh Hartlett is definitely interested. That's from your.
That was from the diary.
Diaries.
Yes,
Right. So you had all that there at your fingertips.
I did. Probably. I sometimes put in bits that strike me as interesting or funny.
So it's not. So as well as the
Yes.
day-to-day details, there's also the extra kind of little
Yes.
bits of information.
But they're not. But the diary's very straightforward. I mean, I recently found a book of the diaries by Lindsay Anderson, the English director. You probably all Lindsay Anderson, yes. And I'd known Lindsay in London in the 60s. He was a bit of a pain in the bum, really. He was on the committee at the British Film Institute when I was there. But when you read the diary, it's very, very interesting. And he analysed his day-to-day life and the characters he met in enormous detail. And I read it and I thought, oh, my diary's a completely trivial load of crap compared with this.
Perhaps some of the energy that he would have liked to have put into his films went into his diaries, maybe.
He was pretty clever man.
Yeah.
And a wonderful stage director.
Now you're just perhaps that's a good segue because opera has become something you've been able to direct as well.
Yes, I've always loved opera, and since I saw the first one when I was about 15, I think, and yes, and then.
But that wasn't something where you said to yourself, "I'd like to direct one day."
No,
never would have occurred to you
because I'm not a musician and I can't read music, and I didn't realise for quite a long time that hardly any opera directors can read music. In fact, a lot of the singers can't. Pavarotti couldn't read music. A lot of them can't. But I was at a festival and I met the composer Giancarlo Menotti. And Menotti said to me, "Oh, you're the film director." He said, "Why don't you come here and direct an opera?" And I said, "Oh, I can't read music." And he said, "I'm not asking you to conduct it." He said, "You're directing it like a play." And I thought, that's true. So I did one. And then I've done quite a few. I did one in Melbourne this year, the Rossini Otello.
Oh, which
Melbourne Opera.
doesn't get done very often, does it, that one?
Never been done in Australia before. It's a wonderful opera.
Do you have a wish list of operas you'd like to?
Oh, yes, I do.
Yes.
I just sent the list to Melbourne Opera.
Ah.
And in fact, I called the director this morning and said, we have to do Peter Grimes.
That would be wonderful.
Oh, fabulous.
Yes. Yeah. With projects, and you have written a book which is called "The Best Film I Never Made,"
Yes.
which and which is one of the chapters, and the best film you never made is what Boswell for the Defence, isn't it?
Oh. Yeah.
Now, I mean, I probably perhaps we shouldn't go into it, but yes, you do have a tenacity. I mean, Ladies in Black. Was it 25 years before it finally got made?
Yes, it was about 23 years before we got the money.
And the other one, and there's another Henry Handel Richardson project that you would
Oh,
love?
Fortunes of Richard Marnie.
Yes. Now,
Yes. Well, I wrote a feature script of that, and I also did a TV adaptation, but we never,
do you
no
really?
one ever showed the slightest interest.
Don't you think that with the television the way it's going, that there's still a chance for that one?
Fortunes of Richard Marnie would seem to me to be absolutely ideal,
Yes.
because it's set in Victoria, a lot of it in Melbourne in the late 19th century and into the 20th. It's very dramatic. It covers the Eureka Stockade and then Marnie himself slowly going mad and his wife having to take over. It's incredibly dramatic, and I think, in my opinion, one of the greatest novels ever written.
So, is there a chance that would you try and get it going again?
I think I've given up on it.
Oh,
I tried on that one for quite a while.
okay. Well, I'm just
After a while,
One
like
more
maybe 30 or 40 years, you'd say, "Oh, scrap it.
Yes.
We'll do something else."
There are a few that you have given up on. Yeah.
Yes, there are a few.
Yeah. So what do you have sort of ahead of you right now?
Well, keep this. Don't let this get around.
No. Just between you and me.
Just between us. Yes.
Yes.
It's. I have a screenplay by David Williamson called Nearer the Gods, which is about Isaac Newton, which I think is an absolutely wonderful bit of writing. And I know it sounds like it could be boring, but it's not. It's very exciting and it's terribly funny. Amazingly enough, it's with David's character insights, it's very funny. And I've been to England. We're trying to set up a UK-Australian co-production on that.
And
Still, well, I've only been back a few weeks from those meetings. Yeah. So I'm hoping that'll happen.
So that's the one in the immediate future. So I know there's some on the often erroneous IMDb.
Oh, they've got the Monash film.
The Monash
Well,
film,
Monash is another very good script. There's a producer from Adelaide called Helen Leake. Very nice woman who's done quite a bit of work. And it's written by Louis Nowra, a very fine writer. And it would make a very good film. It's quite expensive. Helen is at the moment putting it all together and is very confident that we can do it.
And which period of his life is
Well,
it?
it's only him on the Western Front.
Right. So yeah,
During World War I.
So you'll need.
It's only that.
You'll need some money.
Yes. You don't know anyone, do you? But anyway, Helen Leake is. She's chasing it all up, and
because they're such an important part of the process. A determined producer can do so much for you.
A determined, involved producer can make all the difference. You see, it's why I've done 3 films with Sue Milliken in Sydney, because she's very determined, she's very honest, and she's very, very good to deal with. I mean, she knows, she sits down, she works it all out, she knows who to go to, and she's very fair with them. She never lies to them about costs or returns or anything. So, you know, if you're in her hands, you're going to get a good deal.
So you've been involved with the Australian film industry since that period of renaissance in the 70s. And if you look back and forward, what are the things you think that have been most successful, you know, the conditions that have made it possible to make films? And also, what are the things that you would like to change?
I don't know that I'd change anything. I mean, ever since the government first set up that film fund, when we did Mackenzie in 72, something like that, there's been an incredible number of Australian films which actually have been shown all over the world, won festival prizes and got all sorts of acclaim. And the only thing that disappoints me a bit is that sometimes I see Australian films like on TV or at a small screening, and you think, everybody should be watching this film, it's wonderful. I mean, I just wish that the distribution was a bit more full-blooded, because I see many fine films. Sometimes I've seen some on American TV and I thought, never heard of this film in Australia. You know, why wasn't it in the theatres? Why weren't we all going? Of course, on the other hand, you know, it's hard to market films without big names in them, and they've got problems. You know, there are problems too.
So there's nothing. No, if you had the opportunity to change something about the industry, there's nothing particular that you'd.
No,
that
I mean,
you
the
do?
government setups are pretty good. They're very bureaucratic.
Yes.
I suppose that's inevitable.
Right.
They are very, very bureaucratic. I mean, the amount of paperwork that goes on is
You'd
astonishing.
like to
Yeah,
see a
it's
bit
amazing.
more of the Dino De Laurentiis,
But maybe
bit less of the
it's
paperwork.
inevitable, and maybe there's no way around it. But there's nothing but goodwill from those people. I mean, everyone gets upset when they reject films, but they've got to make choices. I mean, you know, they're going to reject projects and they're going to okay projects. They have to be allowed to do that.
Yes. Yes.
So
It's such an
but
expensive
it's a good
business.
setup. And then, of course, what's happened as well, they've encouraged the investment from distributors, Roadshow and people like that come in and put money in as well. So it's all built up quite well. I mean, every country in the world's got trouble with making films, but we make a lot of films here in Australia for a country with only 22 million people. And I think a lot of very good films.
And that's something, yes, we have to. And I guess that's it. We just have to keep making films.
Yeah,
That's
well, we
the way
will.
to-
It'll never stop now.
No, no, no.
We've got it. It's permanent.
I'm going to turn things over to the audience in a minute, but I just wanted to ask you just one last question. I know that you think that you can spot a director's style, but I also gather you're not a big fan of a Bruce Beresford film proclamation at the front, or a so-and-so film, or a film by so-and-so. That you're not a fan of that?
I think it's rather arrogant.
Yes.
I mean, films are made really, even if you wrote and directed it, you're relying on a lot of wonderful actors, a cameraman, a designer, an editor. So just to put your own name on seems to me very unfair to everybody else.
Yes, yeah. You've already got it on as
You've
director.
got it. I mean, having it there as director is enough
Is
for
enough.
me.
Yeah. No, it is. It's a strange, but seems quite obligatory in a lot of even a.
Even people doing a first film.
Yes.
Yes. Well, you know.
Well, let me turn it over to the audience now. I think we have some roving microphones. There's just there. Could you raise your hand up? Yeah, this gentleman here, please.
Oh, Bruce, is it true that you turned down the directing of Empire Strikes Back?
No.
Because I read that somewhere once, a long time ago.
Oh, somebody made it up.
Oh, okay, yeah. It was kind of weird when I did actually see it, yeah.
No.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Just down here.
Hi, Bruce. I just wanted to ask about Tender Mercies. George Dreyfus wrote music for Tender Mercies that the score was actually removed from the film, but his name was still in the credits. Can you explain what happened
they
there?
didn't take his name off the credits. I mean, look, it's a sad story, actually. George wrote a wonderful score. It was terrific. He's a marvellous composer. And when I did a cut of the film, and the film wasn't married to the music, I looked at it and I said to the producers, the film doesn't need a score by anybody. I said, we just need the country and western songs that are in it. I said, the score clashes with the country and western songs, and I think we should take it off. And I don't think George has ever forgiven me, and I don't blame him. But that was my reasoning.
Got another one here.
You go ahead. Hi, Bruce. My name's Anthony. I'm a film student currently, and I say this as someone who's tried to imitate in one of my short films your last scene, some of the tone of your last scene from Black Robe. What's it like being in the business long enough to see people maybe even reimagine or do the same sort of thing, like, for instance, with Tender Mercies, Crazy Heart, or Scorsese touching on some of the same things as Black Robe and Silence, or The Green Book and Driving Miss Daisy. What's it like to be in the industry long enough and have great success and then see people touch those same themes?
I don't know that that's what they're doing. I think they're just usually doing films that in some faint way have some similarity. I mean, what was the film like Daisy? What was it?
Green Book.
Green Book. Well, yes, but Green Book, I thought, which my wife and I saw it after release, we'd been out for a while. I thought it was wonderful. And the only similarity with Driving Miss Daisy is two people in a car. But you could find lots of other movies like that too. I thought it was extremely well done and marvellously acted and directed.
I mean, particularly Crazy Heart.
Crazy Heart, well,
They do have
wasn't that
certain
similar.
things.
It
They have
wasn't
some
that
things
similar.
in common.
I
don't
mean,
they?
and that was a guy with concerts and things. I mean, Tender Mercies was really just Duvall as a sort of washed-up singer staying in a sort of roadside motel and getting to know the woman and her son who were there. It was really, I thought it was really quite different.
He wrote a couple of those. You got him to use some of his own songs in that, didn't you?
Duvall, no, he only sang. He really can't sing for nuts.
No. But didn't he compose?
He only
didn't
sang.
he compose
he sang,
something?
Oh
I thought he.
no, he sang one song. I'll hold the ladder, you climb to the top.
Yes.
I mean, that was a song that we picked because his very limited vocal range could handle it. Like a lot of actors, he could imitate a singer. He was good. He didn't pretend he was a singer, but he could actually get away with something fairly simple. But he didn't write the songs.
Oh, I thought there was one. I thought I'd read that. But anyway, down here at the front. Sorry, just wait for. Yeah.
You just broke a couple of amazing actors, Brian Brown and Jack Thompson in Breaker Morant. It's such a fantastic film that's even more relevant today, perhaps, than it was back then. And I had two questions. One, can you just talk about sort of bringing how those actors came out in that amazing film? And secondly, Mr. Johnson, such a brilliant film, perhaps an underappreciated film, I think. And Black Robe, two very, very amazing films about other cultures made by an Australian director. Can you talk a little bit about how hard it was to get those films made? I mean, Mr. Johnson is hardly even seen or remembered now, but at the time, a Joyce Carey novel, such a great writer. I know there's a couple of questions there, but...
Well, Mr. Johnson, which I think is the best reviewed film I ever made, you're right, it hardly got shown. The trouble was, when they released it in America, African Americans went bananas in the theatres. There were almost riots. And they said, oh, this black man is the servant of the white man. And I was at one of these meeting things and I said, he's got a job, that's all. I mean, he's a clerk working in an office. He's not the servant of the white man, but I mean, it was... The studio immediately backed off and wouldn't have any more to do with distributing the film. And they never put out a DVD. There's one out now, I believe. Someone's put one out very recently, but I haven't got it. But it just got completely clamped down, which was just political correctness. You're right, it was adapted from a wonderful novel by Joyce Carey, who was in fact himself a district officer in Nigeria in the 1920s. It was written from first-hand experience, which I recognised immediately because when I was about 23 or 24, I spent 2 years in Nigeria working as a film editor in a Nigerian film unit, which was pretty much of a shambles. But it turned out quite well because I had nothing to do in the film unit, but I joined an African theatre group called the Yanugu Players, and I directed plays for them and acted in them. And it was, later on I realised it was very valuable.
That you'd learned quite a lot from doing that, yeah.
A lot of those actors were very good. And when I went back to do Mr. Johnson, I got a couple of them in the film.
I think the other part of the question was about,
About Brian Brown.
and,
Brian, well, of course they were...
and Jack Thompson, yeah.
Yes, well, Brian was someone I picked to play that role. And I remember saying to him when I was doing the script, I must have met him, I met him somewhere, and I said, agree to do it now, and I'll write it specifically for you so that I know it's exactly the sort of stuff that would work very well with your kind of personality. And he said, all right, I'll do it. And Jack was someone I never knew. I'd seen him in films. And I always thought he was very good. He was in a film, a Burstall film called Peterson. I thought he was tremendous, very natural, and he had great presence. And then Roadshow, who were going to finance or part finance the film, said, we'll only do it if Jack Thompson plays the attorney. And I said, oh, God. And I said, what if he won't? Jack was overseas at the time. And they said, well, we won't do it. So I called, they gave me a phone number for Jack, and I called him and I said, look, it's Bruce Beresford. I've got this project. I know you haven't read it yet, but it's set in the Boer War, and you're an attorney directing these, defending these soldiers. And he said, oh, that's right, mate, I'll do it. And I said, well, I'll send you the script. He said, yeah, sure.
Phew. I think we've got another question. Just, there is someone down the front here, perhaps when you get a bit late. No, not now, but can
There's
we get
a very underdressed lady.
Yeah.
Me?
So perhaps, yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, so my question is, back in the golden era of the 1970s, when Australian films were the flavour of the month, something seems to have happened, particularly in recent decades, where, like in the last 10 years, very few Australian films have made it into the main competition at the Cannes Film Festival. We seem to be very good at exporting actors, but not exporting Australian stories. And why do you think that is, and how can we remedy that so that our films maybe have another wave of being, you know, the flavour of the month and resonating with international audiences?
Oh, I didn't realise that. They haven't really...
We haven't had one in competition
To me,
for quite a long time.
I think there's been some pretty remarkable films made all along the way. How long since anything's been in Cannes? I'm sure you're wrong about that. It's been... Huh?
I think that there've been short films, definitely. But the main competition, eligible for the Palme features, eligible for the Palme d'Or, it's been a while.
Yeah, I know I haven't had...
The point of the question is, our actors and our crews seem to work so well around the world, our Nicoles, Russells, Kates and Hughes, but Australian films, we're not exporting Australian stories nearly as successfully. So our funding bodies are funding these Australian films, which many of them have a lot of merit, but it seems to be almost like a training ground for the crews and the actors to then get work internationally while the stories don't travel internationally. This is just my view, but I'm wondering if you can speak.
That does fit a little bit with something you said before, Bruce, about things, you know, like somehow not being seen enough. It is a similar point, I think, to something you mentioned just before.
It hasn't occurred to me that the Australian films have dropped in quality. It seemed to me there's a continuous stream of really very interesting films. A lot of them pretty low budget.
It's harder for independent films and smaller films to find audiences and screens now than it used to be, though. Wouldn't you agree?
The independent, well, yes.
Just
I mean,
small,
they get small.
beyond outside the multiplex. I mean, the multiplexes are filling up.
Of course.
And there are fewer smaller, you know, cinemas.
Yes, there are. Although getting films on in a sort of art house setup is kind of suicidal. You never make anything out of it, really. But look at now, you've got the second and third biggest films in the Australian box office at the moment are Australian films. And they're Palm Beach and the Vietnam film.
Yes, the Battle of Long.
Yeah.
Danger
So
Close,
maybe they'll go to Cannes and sweep off all the prizes. Look, these things ebb and flow, you know. I mean, I think you could be sitting in Czech Republic and saying the same thing, and all the Czechs sitting around saying we've got to make some better films and get them into Cannes. I think they ebb and flow everywhere.
Hi, Bruce. Hi. I love your the best film I never made book, and I wish you'd actually write more books because you've so
Nobody's bought those bloody books.
Yeah, I have, and because I'm Latvian, so it kind of made me laugh when you were going to do a location scout in Latvia. But I just wanted to know of any other cool cosmical synchronicities you wanted to share with us today that have happened.
Any what?
Cool cosmical synchronicities.
Eccentricities.
Synchronicities.
Can you give us an example of what you mean?
Well, just those, fateful cosmical moments where it's like your inner reflecting your outer world, or fate, destiny. It's hard to describe because it's like the Carl Jung kind of a causal connection.
It's hard to understand too.
Oh.
Just you mean the idea of a sort of a wonderful serendipitous moment of
All
some
of those,
kind?
yeah.
Any great moments of serendipity that you can think of?
No.
Not right now.
Serendipity.
Not right now. I think
think
it's
so.
it'll probably occur to you as soon as we've finished, I'm afraid. Yep.
Sorry. You read them. You've got the books. There must be something in there that you're enjoying.
Hi, Bruce. I hope I won't baffle you as much with this one, but one of my favourite films of yours is Money Movers, the action thriller from the late 70s. It's really unique for the period when most other Aussie films were period outback ones. It's a contemporary urban crime thriller. It's really exciting. I think
I've never seen it again.
Oh, really?
No.
You should. It stacks up incredibly
Really?
well today.
Second that. Yep.
Yeah, the final fight and shootout, the editing is like nothing I've seen in any Australian film before or since. And I understand that it was sort of an afterthought. You'd read Devon Minchin's novel, and the SAFC just happened to have a bit of extra funding, and they think, we've got to put this into something.
I think we've got a moment of serendipity here.
Maybe that is one.
No, it's kind of... What happened was that I was supposed to do a film for the SAFC called The Ferryman, which was a script I'd written based on a famous murder case that took place attempted murder rather, took place in Sydney about 1915 or 16. And it was a ferryman who, his wife was accused of trying to murder him. It was a famous case. And then at the last minute, the SAFC didn't want to do it. And they said, you've got to find something else. So I said, oh, God, I've got this already. I've written the script, and I've researched the case, the actual case. I've been through the files. No, they don't want to do it. So I was in a bookshop, and I saw this book of the... what's it?
The Money Movers. Devon Minchin's. Was it
Devon Minchin's
Money
book, yeah.
Because he was a security. He worked in security.
He owned a security firm. It said on the back, and I thought, well, that might be interesting. So I bought the copy of the book, and then I took it to the SAFC and said, this might make a good thriller. And we could do this fairly quickly because it's all urban and we could shoot it in Adelaide. And that was it. Came in as a sort of ad hoc kind of thing at the last minute.
Did it make a profit?
No, certainly didn't. I don't think it hardly got released. I think it was.
Yeah, no, I think it's yes. I think it's one and one of those sort of, recently discovered, underseen, interesting Australian films.
I remember I thought the action scenes were good at the time when I was, because I love with action scenes. I choreographed them just like everything else, so every bullet hit, every movement is all worked out, and of course it's great fun doing it. You think, now someone grabs him, throws him through a plate glass window, and you go on and on. It's enjoyable.
As long as it's on the storyboard. Oh, I'm afraid we have time for only one more question.
I've got a really quick question if you want to do two.
Very good offer. I'll take you up on it.
David Fincher likes to use 27mm lenses on the whole of Fight Club. Do you have any film lenses that you favour over the other ones?
No, not really. I've actually been asked that question a couple of times. No, I don't, because it depends entirely on emotionally what I'm trying to do with the scene. Like sometimes if I want to make people look isolated, I'll use a longer lens. And if I want to relate them to other people or to a location, I'll use a much wider one. But I don't have any rule about it. Yeah.
And so, lucky last.
Hi, I was just wondering, what do you look for in a script, or what do you look to include in a script? What is the most important thing?
I don't think I look for anything. I think that it's really just a matter of reacting emotionally to the content. So sometimes, you know, people will send me scripts and I'll think, oh God, it's a load of rubbish. Someone sent me a script recently from America about a little girl who was crazy about pigeons and wanted to race pigeons. And I thought, oh, I'll just read a couple of pages of this. I couldn't put it down. It's wonderful, beautifully written, marvellous. And I thought, I'm not interested in pigeon racing at all, but I got interested in reading that script. And then I got in touch with a writer. And then we went to a studio trying to get it going. I mean, there's still talk going on, but I have a feeling it's another one that won't happen. But I just reacted to the characterizations, which were, you know, the little girl was extremely well drawn, her friends were, an old pigeon fancier in it was marvellous bit of writing, and another one.
So can you see a script that you don't think is very well written, but you can also see potential? Does that happen as well? Or do you really need to have to be immediately?
Yeah,
you have to be grabbed.
I think I would.
Yeah.
Even though we might have to do a lot of things to it.
You can see that something's there, yeah. Look, I'm sure, you know, Bruce...
We've done it, haven't we?
Yeah, I think I think we'll have to leave you one... Well, look, one more then. One more. Is there another? Yep. Oh, I'm so sorry. I may have to... You'll have to choose between them, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I enjoyed that very much. Hi, Bruce. Just very quick question.
Oh, wait a minute. No, we'll do these two then. Okay. Can we start with you at the front? Yeah. Sorry, we'll just. Yep.
My question was what you were talking about before around Philippa was suggesting that you don't like to repeat yourself, so you sort of work in a lot of different genres and subject matter. Is that because you feel that to create something meaningful or something good, you need to be challenging yourself as an artist, and how much is that about, you know, having some sense of uncertainty of whether you can actually do it or not?
No, the only factor is that each film is so involving and so exhausting. And I mean, you can't do a film under a year. So you're on it for a year, and there's so much involvement in the research, the script, working with the actors, cutting it, that once it's done, I need to do something with a different subject.
Yeah, I was just wondering how difficult you think filmmaking should be, because as you said, it is very difficult, but is it sometimes...
No, it's not difficult at all, it's easy. Especially if you're going to sort of con your way through the film industry, it's best to be a director, because you don't really have to do anything. You see, the editor has to learn all this technique. The photographer's got to have an enormous amount of skill. The actors have got to learn all those lines, which is almost impossible. And then they've got to remember the lines and the moves. But if you're directing it, you just say, well, we'll put the camera here and we'll go over there, and we'll say, do that a bit differently, smile a bit more. It's much easier than any other job.
As a director, thank you.
So we just had that very last question. I think someone else had a mic, is that right? And then we'll call it a day, but please, just one more.
Real time, just very quickly. Coming from a film student, what is like that one piece of advice you'd give to someone who wanted to try to get into the Australian film industry?
I think probably, keep turning, keep making, make a couple of short films that attract attention, because certainly producers, networks, and all those people are always on the lookout for young filmmakers who've got something original to say.
There you have it.
Do some good short films.
There you have it. Please thank Bruce Beresford very much.
Thanks, everybody.